Ladies and gentlemen, from discussing the clean economy, we are now going to talk about sports. If you imagine that Copenhagen was to host the Olympic Games, and we decided that Nørrebro should be the new Olympic village, catering for 17,000 athletes from all over the world in a completely new built environment, then you know what job our next speaker has had. Richard Burdett is one of the world's most prominent experts in sustainable cities, and when London won the competition for the Olympic Games in this year, he was given the job of making sure that when building the Olympic City in Stratford, a worn down, almost forgotten part of London, it should not only be green and sustainable, but also give a long-term, big, lasting improvement of London beyond 2012. So it's a pleasure to welcome Richard Burdett, who will tell us the story of how Stratford is made faster, higher, and stronger. Please, Richard.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be back, in my case in Copenhagen, and to share with Bruce and Rob this extraordinary platform with so many important people who understand many of the issues that we're talking about. And it's fantastic, I have to say, that a foundation like Realdania, with the other organizations involved, actually backs this sort of open debate. It's extraordinary, and I wish that the equivalent organizations in the UK did the same thing, not to mention the United States, but we'll get there. I'm telling you a story, as opposed to giving you the bigger picture that Bruce gave you, and he and I often do a double act, and in this case, it really is from the macro to the micro. I'm going to really zoom in to talk about some of the issues that Per has already alluded to, which is how do you use an event, a completely artificial event in the DNA of a city or a metropolis, which is a 2 or 4 week period where lots of people who are very fit do things. How do you use that to actually rebalance the social economy of a city like London? That really is what it's about. We have only a few months to go, 4 months to go for the Olympic Games, and it's very much about rethinking what could happen to a small part of London over the next 20 or 30 years. It really is this question here. If someone happens to give you 11 billion euros without telling too many people what you do with it, and not telling too many people is actually quite important. Don't get too many people involved in the game, so to speak. But how do you use it? And this is, in many ways, the role that I have played together with about 2,000 other people, Per. I certainly didn't do it alone. How do you actually use this as an opportunity? Or as Ken Livingstone, the former mayor of London, and maybe that's why he is the former mayor of London, actually said, it's an excuse to use public money to help London. And I think that's an interesting story. And really what this is about is how do you use this money, how do you use the energy, how do you use the potential vision of design and infrastructure to create something which begins to look like this when it is completed. But we need to take you there. I need to, in a way, take you on the journey in these 20 minutes that we have to explain how we're trying to get there. So the first thing to understand is that London has its own physiognomy. It's a city which in many ways you could say, this might sound arrogant, but I don't want it to be, doesn't need the games to put us on the map. I mean, on the whole, 27 million visitors come to London already. It's one of the centers of the global economy, still today, despite the recession, et cetera, et cetera. So we certainly don't need more visitors. And most Londoners, if you ask them, say, we don't want the games. We don't want the games because it's going to make it really bad to get to work in those 2 weeks. Actually, they're all on holiday anyway because it's in July and August. It doesn't really matter. What we need it for is to deal with an imbalance between some parts of London and the rest. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about. And not necessarily knowing the area that you referred to a moment ago in the introduction, I suspect that what we're talking about is in our case, the east of London, which historically, for 200-300 years, has always been the most deprived. This is a view, and you can see it obviously on both sides. I'm going to probably just point over here, if you can all see, because I can't do it twice. You see Greater London, which is roughly 7 to 8 million people. In fact, it's the blue area. You see the river here, the River Thames, which becomes larger and larger as it goes out towards the North Sea. And you see how London is organized, with the center more or less there. And the Olympic site is more or less in the eastern edge of London, and very important, and try and remember that position in a moment. Many of you here, of course, know London and have visited it often, and you will recognize that just under it over there is where City Airport is, so many of you will have flown there, and where the Millennium Dome is. So Millennium Dome is just underneath it. Now, this is a map which actually shows exactly the same area, but in the darker color shows you where there is the highest concentration of deprivation. That means high unemployment, lower levels of education, lower levels of health, and basically all-round sort of problems. And what you can just see here is that the east of London, compared to the west of London, is disadvantaged. And it has been for a long time, I would say, for at least 100 or so years. And there are many reasons for that. It's to do with many of the things that, of course, Bruce was talking about. Economic restructuring, the manufacturing base of London and the port of London in particular completely collapsed in the 70s and 80s. Hundreds of thousands of jobs were lost along the river port, something you know very well, of course, in Copenhagen itself. So we are now living with the legacy in East London of that problem. Fascinating to see in this city that the whole of the edge of London, the periphery of London, is actually relatively well off, more affluent, while it's the central areas and the eastern area in particular which is more deprived. So you could exaggerate and say the west side, the left-hand side, is more or less like this, and because of the issues I've just described, the east side is more problematic. But there is promise and there is hope, and I'm very optimistic about the initiatives which have been put into place as a result of the Olympics, but also as the result of the thinking which has gone there for about 20 or 30 years about, as I say, rebalancing the social economy of London. East London, because of bombing, because of unemployment, has a legacy also of a large amount of social housing. You sort of see it here, some well-designed, some badly designed, and in some cases you have 80% of the areas are actually social housing stock, and only 20% are private. So there's an interest in actually gentrifying by design, difficult concept as that may be, to actually rebalance London, as I said before. And in the background, you can see right over there, the Olympic Stadium, which I'm going to come back to in a moment. So the project is really setting out to equalize an imbalance. And there's nothing better, which I think symbolizes this imbalance, than a tube map, the underground map of London. If you take the Jubilee line, which is one of the lines which goes from west to east, and you get on it at Westminster, so basically Parliament Square, and you're a man of my age, and you take 7 stops going east. This is not particularly working, but anyway, there we go. You take 7 stops, 1, 2, 3, 4, and you go all the way up to the Olympic Games. You lose today 1 year of life expectancy, right, at every stop. So there's a difference from west to east of 7 years of life expectancy. That's the difference between Hong Kong and Ho Chi Minh City, or Buenos Aires and La Paz. We're talking about continents of difference in one city itself. And these are the issues that Bruce, Rob, and I have to tackle with. Cities are not the same thing. They have many levels of inequalities, and therefore, how do you use a project like this to reconnect with jobs and with opportunities and with place, which is what connects Bruce and I so well in terms of using these initiatives. There's been a policy now since 2002, 2003, under Ken Livingstone, of favoring growth, favoring investment, favoring jobs and new development along the East Corridor and along the Northeast Corridor there. And where the Olympics Games are going to be is right at the junction of these two important corridors. Most of East London looks like this. very poorly defined, very fragmented, very broken, with very little sense of place. But it's a fantastic position in terms of sort of, let's call it, European global connections. The airport that I talked about, City Airport, is right there. The high-speed link, which goes to what we still call in London or in England, the continent, is over here, otherwise known as Europe by some. But also there are very important new infrastructure projects being built at this very moment today called Crossrail, a new high-speed line which links Heathrow Airport all the way to the east. So there's a lot happening which actually can build around this place which until very recently was not on the mental map of most Londoners. Stratford is one of the many village centres, not very distinguished, quite messy, quite frayed at the edges, but very, very rich in its sort of diversity. And that's more or less where it is if you begin to zoom in. Now, if you take an A to Z map, it's our typical map of London from 4 years ago, in 2005, 7 years ago, of the area I'm going to talk about, basically you can see it's an enormous hole in the fabric of London. There was only one road connecting through to it, big railway yards and sort of empty depots over there. Very, very few people actually lived on the site in 2005, the year that we won the bid for the Olympics of 2012. I'm going to come back to that image at the very end. So the project, for those of you who are architects and planners and designers in the room, is about that. It's about restitching the social and the physical and the employment fabric of this part of London. It's turning something which for 2 weeks or 4 weeks effectively is a closed event into something which really reconnects with the city. Now, much of it is there. We don't have time and we don't need to go into great detail about the actually incredibly well-connected facilities which exist at Stratford. 11 underground lines and many suburban rail facilities already connect to here. You can go from, let's call it central London, to this part of London in 7-8 minutes using a number of links. And importantly, the trains to Brussels and to Lille and to Paris will actually be stopping on the site from next year. So it's incredibly well connected. But the reason that this part of London is changing is not just to do with the investment of £9.3 billion of public money. In fact, many of us probably don't even remember that in 2002, a series of private developers, Chelsfield, Stanhope, very big names in the property industry in the UK, put together a bid for a £2 billion development which got planning permission for a massive shopping centre and a large amount of housing. And what happened, and this is very typical of, I would say, the British planning system, very pragmatic way of doing things, that planning and development go arm in arm. All that happened is that when we won the Olympics, 3 years after this, we adopted that plan and integrated the two. So all these images here, these housing, which I'm going to describe in greater detail in a moment, was already planned as part of a private development 3 years before the Games. We won the Games and we said, let's piggyback on that. Let's actually try and make something out of it, which in fact is what's happened. We won the Games by mistake, by the way. Apparently we beat Paris by 2 votes. One is because the Greek representative pressed the wrong button. And the other one is because our dear friend Jacques Chirac, as he was president, offended the Scandinavians so much that they voted for us instead. So we won without expecting it and came up with a very haphazard plan, which is to scatter most of the events around London rather than build too many new things, with the exception of concentrating the athletes' village, where 17,000 people would actually come and stay, with some of the core facilities in this part of London called Stratford. So remember that there's been real estate, private sector interest in this area anyway, so the public sector money comes on top of that, and so the story sort of goes on. In fact, only a few months ago, the Stratford shopping centre, funded by the major Australian company Westfield, opened to great acclaim and made Boris Johnson, the mayor, incredibly happy to be able to stand next to the very distinguished people in East London. So let's talk about the project as a piece of planning and how the Olympics is part of this bigger project and how it will, in fact, leave a legacy. First of all, we've described a little bit the site. It's more or less in that sort of part of London. Very important you see that it connects not just to the physical fabric in ways that I've described, the housings and the streets, but it also connects to a very beautiful system of greenery and water. These are the major water reservoirs from the north of England and canals which used to come here from the 17th and 18th century, serving the docklands of London. This is a picture taken about 4 or 5 years ago on the site. Incredibly magical. And as you all know here, how do you do a mega project without destroying the qualities of what is there? And qualities are not just to do with nature and space, but also the quality of the community that is surrounding. Everywhere around the site is made up of what you call the fabric, the texture, and the richness of London's ethnic communities. Pakistanis, Bengalis, more recently wider European areas, Hungarians, Latvians, Lithuanians, have all sort of found their own niches of life in this area. So working with the urban grain and the social grain is absolutely central, because this is what the site actually looked like before. One can get romantic about background areas, but actually this was a dump. Quite literally, for 200 years was used as a dump for all sorts of things. So to clean this up becomes really quite problematic. Not only was it a dump, it also had major electricity pylons all across the site. Now, you know in this room that to move electricity pylons is a showstopper in terms of investment. Who's going to give you 200 million, 300 million pounds to move it? The Olympic Games did. Otherwise, little of this actually would have happened. There are 2 new energy centers which actually provide clean energy to the site, so it's a much bigger picture than just design. But let me focus in the few minutes that we have left on the ingredients which have made the master plan work in the way that I think it does. This is a view just about a year ago of the construction site. So from this depot area, but with beautiful sort of connections and green and water, we suddenly have, for a number of years, the largest construction site in Europe, at its peak actually employing 12,000 workers. By the way, saved the British housing and construction industry at the time of the recession. If we didn't have these 12,000 jobs, we'd have a much bigger problem picking up as the curve goes up again. And this is a view of what is actually intended there. It's a computer view, and I'll come back to the real views in a moment. The idea is extremely simple. A big park in the middle, a lot of some of the sports facilities, velodrome, basketball, etc., a new media center over there, and then a lot of housing and other elements around it. So again, the theme here is how do you use this to make a piece of city? And this is where I just want your attention on the detail for a few minutes, and then we'll look at some big pictures and try and compete with Bruce in terms of excitement of the visual images. Right in the middle here is the international station that I described, with all the connections to the tube. Over here is a massive shopping center, which I've already described, and in the center is the park. It's difficult to see at this distance, but let's look at it this way. Here's a park. Try and make something around it. There's green, there's water, so make it a heart. Make a new place that people can identify with. Then, instead of 1 connection, add 38 connections. So that's where the infrastructure funding went in. 38 different bridges which go up and over water systems, railway, motorways, whatever is there. There was only 1 connection, and there are now about 38 crossing points. Very, very important. Then put jobs next to where there's good transport. So very simply, what we see if we go there today is the shopping center, the first piece of housing of the jigsaw that I'm going to describe more elaborately, and what is the media center for the press will become the first place after the Games in 2013 for something like 2,000 or 3,000 jobs. So it's a very holistic approach to what happens to the site. Importantly, as a strategy, we've learned from every other city that has held the Olympics, which is, for heaven's sakes, don't keep stuff that you don't need, right? Now, first of all, the Brits only win Olympics in sports sitting down. Very important. Cycling, horseback, or sailing. They don't really win on anything else. So only build those facilities that you need to win Olympics and that people need. But also, more importantly, just don't keep a hockey stadium if no one is actually going to play it, or basketball. Americans do basketball better than we do, so why keep it? So the idea is that you actually spread many of the venues, the stars here, which are temporary, and they're designed to be demounted and taken away, or actually just move somewhere else in other parts of the UK or other parts of London. And that model has worked. And only 4 of the venues, and I'll describe them, are actually permanent. But even those venues have been designed to be retrofitted to be made smaller, to be designed in such a way that they work for the local community after the games and not for the millions of people who are going to be there during the games. So that very much is the project. This is the most important diagram of all, which basically shows a lot of white space. Right? Now, for you in the room who are developers, you can lick your lips with excitement, right? Because what has happened? The land has been decontaminated. There's more access than would ever have been there before. The value of the land is beginning to go up simply because I'm here talking to you about it, let alone 2 billion people are going to see this on television in a few months from now. So all these pieces of white land are actually part of the development over the next 20, 30 years of housing, jobs, and other activities over time. And let me explain that to you very, very simply with these two maps. The idea is that you can see it over here in terms of the statistics, that you, going back a moment, the only 4 venues that remain are there. All the other venues are removed, and therefore you have clean soil with good access, the sustainable systems of energy that I've already described, and therefore perfect plots for housing redevelopment. And what you begin to see over here is that around the park, you have a series of neighborhoods which are being planned, but most importantly, over the next 20-odd years, will expand to a much wider area. Now, I'm going to come back to this at the very end in terms of an image that if you half close your eyes, or anyway, at the distance of where you're seeing this at the back of the room, it feels like London. It doesn't feel like a completely new piece of city. There's a sort of grain, there's a mixture of scales, there's a park, there's a railway, there's big housing, there's small housing, but it's very much what London actually feels like. And the master plan, if it distinguishes itself in any particular way, is because of that sort of flexibility over time. We don't know if there's going to be another recession in 5 years, so we might as well design a system which is totally flexible to what the market may need or not need over time. And I think that is one of the strengths. So this is a computer view of what happens in the games, and there you see a number of these venues around the central park, and that's actually the first computer image. Some of those temporary venues are taken away, and you begin to see the new housing developments around the park. So that's during the games this summer, and that's probably what would happen by about 2014, 2015. So what's it actually like on the ground? And I'm going to go very quickly through this before I reach my conclusions. We've only got 4 months to go, and these are a series of images literally taken in the last months by me or by other people. You see how uncannily like the computer view this is. This is a helicopter view taken a few weeks ago. So all this blue stuff, which are hockey stadium, or that one, which is the basketball, will be taken down, and actually very interesting, the basketball stadium is being bought by the Rio Olympics, dismantled, brought over there, because they don't have a basketball stadium. Now, that's sustainability of another sort in terms of actually creating long-term value and reducing the embedded energy that you actually need to use. Now, I told you there was beauty on the site, but there was also a lot of squalor. This is actually what the new park, only realized in the last 6 months, effectively, actually looks like. And frankly, it could be St. James or Hyde Park compared to other parts of London. So what a gift this is to future generations of people who are going to grow up in London. They can go and walk here with their kids, exercise, and do other things, which certainly today would not be possible. This was a competition for the velodrome, for the major cycling center, which actually was opened only a few weeks ago. This is what it looks like. And as I say, the Brits win lots of medals sitting down, and they've already started training for this. This is Chris Hoy, who's won 8 medals, gold medals last time, and probably will win a similar number. Here's the basketball stadium, a beautiful structure, but it's actually a sport, as I say, that we don't really play. There's no point in keeping it there and occupying an enormous piece of space. Therefore, it's actually been designed to demount it and, as I say, move on to Rio. And so many of the other structures are of this sort. Even the beautiful aquatic center designed by great architect Zaha Hadid has been designed ultimately to look like this. Beautiful shape with 2 swimming pools, Olympic size inside. But this has been designed for the community from 2013 on. which means 4,000 or 5,000 seats maximum. During the games, it's the most popular sport at the beginning. You probably remember when everyone is glued to the television. It has 17,000 seats. 17,000 seats. So where the hell do you put them? Well, you add very ugly wings on the side. And these are just temporary seating. These will go down. So you go and see it now, and the architect agrees with me. This is not a very nice image of her building. But these will come down after next summer, and you get that slim, beautiful space which actually looks like that inside, which I think is absolutely extraordinary. So this is the story in many ways, at the macro scale and at the micro scale of the decisions that are being by architects, being made by designers, but also by politicians, which is where I want to end in a moment, in relation to who actually is going to be living there and what does the place actually feel like. I mean, even the stadium itself, you can see over there, has been designed to be completely redesigned and reduced from 80,000 seats to only 25,000 seats if future football teams or rugby teams need that. So, what's this piece of city actually like, Per? And this is where I'm going to conclude. The thing which I think interests many of you here, apart from the venues themselves, is the interrelationship between the venues, the public spaces, the facilities, and the housing. And these are the first images that you'll see of the housing itself. Basically, what you see here is nearly 3,000 units, 2,808, half of which are for the social sector. So, in other words, a combination of housing associations and others that, if we have time, we can talk about later. But very importantly, you can see it here in the colors, pepper-potted, as we call it, spread out in different parts of the whole site. In other words, you don't have all one part which is blue or all one part which is brown. This is a new model and a very important way of trying to actually integrate different social groups, different income groups together, but benefit from all the facilities and the investment that has been made. These are images of what the place actually looks like, which I think, as far as contemporary housing in London, comes close to what you do naturally here with your eyes closed. So I'm very proud of this, but I do feel a bit ashamed when I actually see what you're doing in this city. But very importantly, they're being designed not just as big, sort of tall apartment blocks, but they actually have townhouses, three-story townhouses with front doors along each of the streets. Now, the most important thing here to begin to say, has this worked or will it work, is that only 3 months ago, the part of the Olympic Village, which is not social, which is not owned by the housing associations, was bought by the Qatari royal family with a joint venture with a British company for £650 million, right? So it's all been rebranded. It used to be called the Athletes' Village, the Olympic Village. Now they call it very cool East Village, London. And very interestingly, the whole thing is being sort of promoted as a piece of cool London like Notting Hill and everything else, and interestingly for us, all for rental. We don't have time to go into that, but importantly, there are the ingredients here to make a real piece of city. There are schools, there are jobs, there are shopping centers, whether we like them or not. There's even a bit of art. We have a mayor who's completely obsessed with the French, and basically says, if the French can do the Eiffel Tower, why can't we do something ourselves? So we've got this rather strange structure, but I don't want to comment on that. So finally, will it work? I think yes, but not if you say and look at it over 2 weeks, or over 4 weeks, or over 2 years. It's a very long-term investment whereby the 9.3 billion can be measured around that. It's already triggered something like 10 to 15 billion of private investment in the areas around the site, not on the site itself. Last 3 slides. This is what I showed you, what the site looked like in 2005, right? This big hole in the middle of London. This is what will look like this summer. Most importantly, maybe in 2030 it will look like that. Again, a normal, natural piece of London, but brought forward to the time and the schedule required by the Olympic Games. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ricky, and fascinating story. And you've just convinced me that Copenhagen should make a bid for the Olympics in the near future. I mean, what's not to like? What's the problem? I mean, you sound in your introduction a bit skeptical. The Brits are not that crazy about it. The Londoners are not. But it looks as there are plenty of upsides.
Well, the first thing is, of course, you and your colleagues who would do that would have to face at least 7 years of hate mail, right? I mean, you would. The amount of negative energy that these projects create is quite extraordinary. And that's why it's interesting how, in many ways, the story has been kept quite quiet. It's not a very big public thing. The press hasn't talked about it very much, and in a very English way, it's been sort of quite controlled. But I mean, I think behind your question is that any initiative, and of course it doesn't need to be the Olympics, but any initiative that focuses investment and also creates a decision-making structure which facilitates important and risky decisions, difficult decisions, which might be risky at the time, is, I think, to be commended. This is what Bruce was talking about before. There's a link between bad metro governance or no metro governance, no regional sort of sense or lack of or weakness from the federal level, and this happened. This could have only happened if central government put in the money and ring-fenced the decision-making to a basically new group of people called the Olympic Delivery Authority, which expires at the end of this year, to take the politics and the heat out of that. Ultimately, will this benefit people who live there? I think for sure. I mean, the most important thing is to measure it in such a way, and this would be an issue for you here, is that you don't have polarization within this part of poor London, that you don't end up with a middle-class rich ghetto, and that's why you have to have the sorts of mechanisms that I've already talked about.
Okay, so one thing I was wondering, there was a lot in your speech about public transport, trains, airports and so on. What about the cars? Where are they? Is this a car-free area? Or?
Well, actually, importantly, in July, you will not be able to drive to the games. It's a car-free games, unless you're a member of the IOC. And then you use the motorways. But that's, it's a tiny number, 2,000 cars. But basically, you can only go by public transport, and a new high-speed rail link has been made from King's Cross, where the train from Europe arrives. So afterwards, it will basically allow cars, but as anywhere in a big city, I mean, London has high car ownership, but low car use. About 65% of the population uses public transport, not bicycles, to go to work. That's what will happen there. People will park their car. The standards are lower than other parts of London, but there is no doubt that people will use the excellent transport facilities to go to work in other parts of the city.
So in many ways, what we're seeing here is not just an Olympic project, but it's a sneak preview of how a more green, more sustainable future city actually could look like, and something that could be replicated all over the world?
Yeah, I think the world in UK planning has been going that way for some time. I was a member of the Urban Task Force with Richard Rogers, with other colleagues, Ann Power, and Bruce was also involved, which I think brought about a shift towards more compact, more sustainable, more connected sort of inner city development. This is just an extreme hyper example of that. I don't think it's unique. It's not that that is going to take us into a sort of paradigm of lifestyle which is completely different. It's just more of it more quickly, so that will make a difference.
But it is a kind of a model that could inspire similar projects around the world with rapid urbanization and the need to build new parts of towns and whole new towns all over the world.
Yeah, but don't forget that we always look to what's happening in Scandinavia here and Holland to know how to do it. So it's like, for me to come and say we're creating a model, I'm not so sure. I think the interesting model here is to use an event as a sort of excuse for 30, 40-year planning. That's probably the biggest game changer.
And it seems to me that in your presentation, you've actually managed to turn the discussion from what are the costs to what kind of investment in the future is this?
Well, I think the quick way of responding to that is that if I had a family and I was bringing up my children in Stratford and I bought a place there, next year. I think that my child would probably live longer than had this happened 3 years ago. Right? I think the health facilities will be improved. The fact that I, as mentioned before, can go out for a walk, they can use the velodrome, the cycling. The school is going to be one of the best schools in London, which is a major issue anyway, which cuts across these debates. So the investment is fundamental, but the investment across the board. I mean, it's not just good housing or good parks or good transport. It's this sort of overlaying and overlapping in many ways of these different issues, which is really important.
Very inspiring. Let's just take a quick poll. Get your red and green cards and let me know if Copenhagen should make a bid for the Olympic Games. Come on, all the green cards. Oh. No? Okay. There were 3 green cards down there. That's the good table. That's the ambitious table. Richard Burdett, thank you very much for joining us on the continent.